Empty Void Eyes Hugo teams up with Lightspeed Loki to go against everyone we've seen in Blue Lock. Or that's what I would say if this was a real matchup. However, that's not the case, because what I am going to tackle today is far more interesting and far more important for us in order to better understand Blue Lock. And that's because I might just have understood how the power system within Blue Lock actually functions. You see, Blue Lock is obviously a shonen show, and typically these shows have a power system that dictates how the interactions or fights between the characters go. However, because Blue Lock is more psychological and because it is about sports, it's always been hard for me to dictate how the power system works in this show, especially because we don't have any transformations or power boosts that would otherwise define a certain power level. However, after the recent chapter, after chapter 343, I truly believe I figured out what's the current power level of Blue Lock and how Hugo and Loki were able to easily outclass it. That's because they present a much higher power level, and this realization actually enabled me to completely lay out how the power system functions within Blue Lock. And so that's what we are going to tackle today. I am going to start from the beginning of the manga, define each and every power level and when the next level was introduced and who introduced it. And this of course would help me guys give you better matchups and at the same time help you understand certain interactions in Blue Lock. For example, how no one was able to handle Shido at that time and how Sai kinda introduced the next level without really doing it. And finally reach the point of how Hugo and Loki completely broke the current power level of Blue Lock, which by definition makes them above every U20 player we have seen up until this point, except Bunny of course, because we don't know where he really stands. However, but of course, let's start from the top and define the first power system introduced in Blue Lock. Let's start with the basics. Now, because every story has humble beginnings and because Blue Lock is no different, the first power system was about as much as you would expect. It was simple, it was straightforward, and the player that I would say defines this level is none other than Baro Shori. Of course, here I'm talking about the formula to the gold power level, where the difference between good players and NPCs is whether they present an ability to reproducibly reach the net. From there, the way we rank the players is also straightforward, and it is entirely based on how robust the formula is. For example, Nagi and Baro were the strongest because their formula often resulted in goals regardless of the opposition. Nagi was outwardly with his trapping, and Baro's formula was so refined that he seemed like an unstoppable force. Which is actually interesting because of how refined his formula was. Everyone regarded Baro as the strongest player. Even the only player that I would say rivaled him at this point, which is Nagi, still looks at him as the strongest. And this is because unlike Nagi or Isagi's formula, Baro is more efficient and doesn't require any help from any other player. He can single-handedly score even when he is pressed or countered. And I gotta say, what's special about this power level is that it truly was the baseline for the coming evolution every player would undergo throughout the first phase of Blue Lock. I mean, Isagi's formula was finding an empty spot plus his direct shot. It quite literally was his game plan up until the end of the U20 game. The only difference was how complex his thought process was compared to the early level. However, let's actually go back to Baro, because saying that he was the strongest at this power level is actually very relevant. Because as soon as the next level was introduced, the strongest previously is no longer the most effective. And this was immediately established by having Baro score 4 goals yet lose nonetheless. In essence, Baro still had the best formula, but it wasn't really enough, signaling that an evolution is due. And that's what the second power level of Blue Lock is all about. It is simply an evolution to the first. Those with simplistic formula simply won't cut it. That's why Naruhaya, Kunigami and Ryo failed. And that's specifically why Chigiri was picked by Isagi. Because when he was pushed by Nagi, he did not stick to his old formula of using only his speed randomly. He evolved it by eliminating the need to stop and trap the ball. That's how Chigiri remained relevant. And that's how Baro's awakening also worked, when he faced someone stronger physically than him, and his refined formula all of a sudden no longer produces results. He faced a crossroad, evolve or be left behind. And obviously we know what happened and how he evolved. But actually this leads me to talk about how we rank players in this level. Well, unlike the first power level, this time it is through how much they evolved. For example, Chigri evolved only once, while someone like Baro did it twice. First with his chop dribbles, but most impressively with his villain playing style, which by the way allowed him to see the field in a unique way that is unrivaled by anyone. And this alone would have obviously made him once more the best player in this selection, had it not of course been for two other players which define the power level here. Of course, I'm talking about Rin and Isagi. Well, almost define this power level. I feel like one of them doesn't really do that. But before we explore this, I want to talk about Nagi, who also evolved twice. First, through using his trapping to go against his opponents and break their charge like he did with Baro and Chigiri, but more importantly through learning to play by himself and to be the one driving his own creativity, which mostly was explored in the Nagi spin-off novel, but also briefly against Ren. Speaking of which, you might think that Ren is the one that defines this power level entirely, but I am here to tell you that he doesn't. He actually was beyond this entire power level. In fact, he was so ahead that if he hadn't a very useless team with half the talent of Isagi's team, there wouldn't have been even a match. He was so ahead that he single-handedly carried his team. When Isagi's team was too strong for Aryu, Bachira and Tokimitsu, it was Rin who kept things at bay single-handedly. And that's because he was beyond this level and he simply overpowered everyone in it. And as a side note, I actually love this because through giving Rin a much weaker team, Kanshiro was able to sell the illusion of Isagi being close to him, when in fact Isagi was quite literally carried by his own team. However, I gotta say, despite being much weaker than Rin, one cannot deny that Isagi without a doubt defined this power level. And here's the crazy part, he did it on two fronts actually. First is the obvious one, because he evolved 3 times throughout the second selection, but more importantly through acquiring the weapon that made him stand out more than anyone in this power level. Of course, I'm talking about his adaptability and how it enabled him to first evolve to utilize his eyes to better position himself, then utilize his opponent's field of view to win one-on-one off the ball, and finally he evolved in the 3 vs 3 game and he started to utilize his teammates and his opponents to control the field, which by the way was the weapon that allowed him to channel Baro, Nagi and Chigiri's talent in order to reach Ren. And so without a doubt, Isagi has to be the player who defines the second power level in Blue Lock, and not really Ren, who I actually think is the one who defines the next power level, the one that was introduced in the third selection. And I know what you might think, this seems like a power level that doesn't matter that much seeing how short and sweet the third selection was. But I am here to tell you that because of what happens after it, the third selection had a crucial role to play, and so did the power level introduced here. But hey, what is this power level I am talking about? Well, you see, since Rin is the one defining it, then you already know it is about perfection. It is about perfecting the basics. Or to put it simply, it is about perfecting the formula to reach the net. And this was apparent because only those who perfected the basics of their playing style were able to perform and prove their worth in this power level. Players like Karasu, Shido, Otoya and Yuki were all the masters of this level. However, none of them was to the level of Ren. Well, actually here I think Shido was much stronger than Ren, but due to how he plays, it was really hard for anyone to make use of his extreme playing style, something that Sai Itoshi found no issue in doing in the next arc, the U20 game. And as much as I would like to tell you that there is a new power level here, and it is defined by Sai or maybe even Shido, the reality is there was no actual new power level in the U20 game. Well, maybe when Sai became serious and Rin went berserk, things went up a level, but that was only for a brief moment and it really doesn't define the game. For the U20 match, where I simply think it was the continuation of the previous power level, where we saw most of the Blue Lockers became masters of the basics of their playing style, while on the other hand the U20 team struggled to keep up because most of them were 1 or 2 levels behind, with Aiko, Sai and Shido being the obvious exception. But here's the crazy part, all of these 3 players were operating at the next power level, and not actually on the current one next to Baro, Isagi and Ren. Well, they were all ahead of the game until Rin went berserk. And I feel like that's how the writer balanced everything beautifully in this game. While Blue Lock would decimate the U20 team, the presence of these 3 players who were ahead of Blue Lock's current level balanced the game perfectly. However, if that was the case, what is this level that Shido, Sai and Aiko were operating at? How does Sai hints at it, and how Rin going berserk kinda introduces it? Well, to answer that, we gotta present the man, the legend, the blue mythical beast, Michael Kaiser. Because you see, he defines the next power level, the power level of the NEL. And I want you guys to understand something here. The first 3 power levels are just the basics, and the writer hinted at that through labeling everything before the NEL as phase 1. And with the Neo Egoist League being phase 2, you kinda have to expect that the next power level is completely different from just mastering the basics of how to reach the net. Because after perfecting the basics, Ego, rightfully so, sent the Blue Lockers to an environment that was multiple leagues of magnitudes harder than before. And through reacting to this much higher level, some of the Blue Lockers were able to achieve the next power level. The power level that dominated for more than half of Blue Lock. It dominated until Hugo and Loki completely broke it. However, what is this new power level and how does Kaiser define it? Well, you see, one might think that what Kaiser did was to introduce Metavision and the Predator Eyes. And while that's definitely true, these two are just weapons and not really parameters that would define a power level. Sure, they might be the most significant weapons in this level, but they do not by any means define its parameters. However, to truly define this power level, we gotta talk about the most important thing that Kaiser actually introduced, which is the presence of systems or the ability to lead said systems. You see, Kaiser was so oppressive that Bastard Munich naturally built a system around him. And that's truly the gist of it. Players in this power level are so oppressive that they either cause a whole system to be built around them, or they are so effective that they could play a crucial role in a system. And I feel like the best way to describe how this power level is different than before is to talk about Kaiser's goal in the Manshine City game. You see, Kaiser found the perfect position for himself through Metavision. And then when he was faced with 5 players, where not a singular player from before would be able to penetrate, Kaiser simply utilized the Predator Eyes and his Kaiser Impact to completely destroy Manshine. That's how oppressive this power level is compared to the previous one. And I feel like 2 of the most significant weapons of this power level are obviously Metavision and the Predator Eyes. Metavision alone opened Isagi's playing style to have a no end. The guy went from struggling to visualize how he would reach the net to actually creating concrete plans in his mind of how he could destroy entire teams. That's the difference between Isagi prior to the NEL and post-Metavision Isagi. The difference is honestly almost day and night. The guy truly skyrocketed. And the same could be said for other players like Berserker Rin, Baro, Chigiri, and even someone like Karasu. And I gotta say something here. Notice how no one could keep up with Shido prior to this level. However, in the PXG game, we see that Berserker Rin, Kaiser, Isagi, Karasu, and even Kunigami are able to keep up with him and are able to understand his playing style. And I want you to focus on this, guys. What seemed completely outwardly in the previous power level seems like the natural, rational play to do in this current one. That's how big of a difference between the previous and this power level. And I know I said that Kaiser was the one who defined it, but different players actually achieved it through reacting to different environments. We all know that Baro, Bachira, Chigiri, and Ryo attained this power level through their masters. However, as I said, Isagi did it in reaction to Noah and Kaiser, and then someone like Rin did it in reaction to Kaiser and Isagi, someone like Karasu did it in reaction to Charles and Isagi, and it goes on. Each player had his own way of attaining this new power level. And actually, even beyond that, if we look at the weapons introduced in this level, you will see that they are far more powerful than the ones before. I mean, look at one of the most oppressive weapons in the third selection, Karasu's way of utilizing his hands. It was such a trivial thing in this new power level that Isagi attained it off screen. That's how big of a difference between the 2 power levels. And I am, guys, saying this to signify how much the Neo Egoist League elevated the Blue Lockers and why they completely decimated Nigeria. Because if they faced Nigeria before the NEL, the game could have went either way. However, after rivaling Kaiser and seeing the Master Strikers, Nigeria seemed like a walk in the park for the Blue Lockers. However, how do we rank players within this power level? Before, it was kinda easy because you could look at someone's formula and how refined it was, and you could dictate where he stands. However, in the NEL, things got a little bit complex, where now, because everyone is operating at such a high level, you need to look for small details that give off where a player stands. For example, how Nico's Metavision is narrower than Isagi's, or how the fastest piece Isagi's Metavision is definitely far ahead of that of Aiko's. However, there is a rule of thumb that we could follow, and it is all about how much the player sees on the field. You see, because Nico's metavision is narrower, he sees less than Isagi, Aiko, and Kaiser, and thus he is inferior. Then Isagi, through the fastest piece and ridding himself of every emotion, actually started to see things more clearly, and thus he is much stronger than his previous self. And the same could be said for Kaiser, who after shedding became an entirely different player that is capable of seeing things that he could not see before. However, you can immediately tell that this rule of thumb kinda favor players with ocular abilities. However, that's actually not the case, because someone like Shido, Ren, and Lorenzo have impeccable perception without necessarily relying on any ocular ability. And I know Ren has the Predator eyes, but he was insane before he awakened them. And even beyond that, seeing the field isn't necessarily all about the vision. It is also about the creativity. For example, someone like Bachira now can visualize how he breaks the team much better than before. Or someone like Chigiri, through his fast dribbles, is able to see a golden formula. And I gotta say that this is one of the main points that define this power level. It is how further you could see into the future of the field. However, if that's the case, and Isagi now is able to see the field on the same level as Noah, Prince, and Levi, what is actually the next level? Didn't we actually reach the pinnacle? Well, no. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we finally get to the idea that sparked this whole video. The way Hugo and Loki handled metavision dictates that they entered the new level. And in fact, with Hugo specifically, I feel like the way he views the world actually dictates that he is 2 levels above Blue Lock. The first level is the one that Karasu adopted. We all know right now that Karasu sees the field much better than Isagi, much better than Ryo, and any other Blue Locker. And that's all because Karasu right now sees things from a different perspective. He has his first perspective, of course, of trying to score, but also he is looking at things from an entirely different angle. He is looking at himself and then dictating what position is the most suitable for his playing style. And through this, Karasu is able to see far beyond every Blue Locker. In fact, he could even see beyond Loki and Charles. However, here's the thing, it is about who can see further into the future of the field, and in all honesty, it is not an entirely different power level. And so for simplicity, we're not going to account for it. I know I said that Hugo presented 2 power level gaps, but we're not going to account for this simply because it is too similar to the previous. The other one, however, is completely insane. You see, as I said, in the NEL's power level, it's all about who can read the field better. However, in chapter 343, Hugo presented a new way of dealing with metavision. However, instead of turning it into a battle of perception, Hugo actually did the unthinkable and overwhelmed 3 metavision players. By having 2 extremely fast players, Kamos and Leiden, circle him, he was able to give himself infinite options. And this required the intervention of 3 metavision players, whom before in the previous power level would have been able to stop Leiden, Kamos, and Hugo. However, that's precisely the bait. Through utilizing very fast players, Hugo was able to create an infinite amount of information stream that rendered their brains frozen for a single second, and that allowed him to dribble between. That's the first time since Loki in the PXG game we see a player overwhelms metavision. However, and since I said Hugo did it before in the PXG game, you already know that he did it once more in this chapter. However, because he is a genius, he did it in a completely different fashion, where through his speed, it doesn't even matter if you have metavision. Even if you could see it coming like Karasu and Aiko did, you actually have no way of stopping anything that Loki is doing. That's the scary part. We reached a power level where even if you could see the field perfectly, it is not enough. Aiko positioned himself perfectly behind Arya, where he could react to anything Hugo could throw. However, Loki simply told him, "Fuck your perfect positioning, I'm fast as F, boy." And in that moment, he completely overwhelmed metavision. And this is exactly what he did back in the PXG game, where he would show up all of a sudden to completely thwart the perfect positioning of Kaiser and Isagi, to the point both went into depression for a split second. And so that's what I believe to be the next power level. And actually now I can dictate how the U20 World Cups would go. Isagi and the Blue Lockers would spend the entirety of the U20 World Cups trying to attain this level, where even if you read the field perfectly, it would not be enough. And I feel like Isagi and the rest of the Blue Lockers would unlock other weapons that help him in this specifically. And then they would face Kaiser and Ness, who attain somewhat of this power level, then Bunny of course would be fully in this power level, and finally against France in the finals it would be both Hugo and Loki at the pinnacle of this current power level. And I feel like there is still just one more thing to talk about. You see, back in the NEL, we've seen the Master Strikers play, and after thinking about it for a bit, I feel like the reason Noah played defensively against both Snuffy and Prince is because he understands that they could break the current power level very easily. Prince specifically is completely unstoppable, and had it not been for Noah, he would definitely overwhelm Isagi, Kaiser, and everyone in that power level. And the proof for that is whenever Prince gets the ball, Noah immediately intervenes, and that's because he understands how dangerous him breaking the current power level would be for the likes of Isagi and Kaiser. It would honestly completely demoralize them. However, with Snuffy and Loki, it was completely different. While sure Noah succeeded against Loki once, he failed against him twice, and the latter actually ended up breaking the spirit of Kaiser and Isagi for a brief moment. And with Snuffy, I feel like because he was just caring about Baru, he ended up not doing any of what he could do. I feel like Snuffy is the same as Hugo. He could utilize the team in order to overwhelm his opponents. And honestly, when I talk like this kinda signals that Loki and Hugo are definitely on the pros level. And while Noah's statement kinda makes Loki on that level, this is a confirmation for Hugo as well. I feel like I would put them on Prince and Levi's level no problem, with Loki being slightly better than Prince and Levi, and Hugo being slightly worse. However, I personally have a counter argument for this theory because I feel like after the U20 World Cups, we need a new power level. A power level that would be introduced through the pros, and in there either Hugo and Loki need to awaken. However, I'm getting ahead of myself here. In essence, this is the power system of Blue Lock. I really hope you guys understood it, because as far as I have seen, no one actually has done this before, and so I really hope I did a good job explaining it. However, that's all I've got for you today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, thank you for watching.